Well, good afternoon. It's a real honor for me to be here and quite an honor to be going last and closing off your presentation. So I guess, for me, I'll let you know something. If you like what I have to say, I hope you think about it. And if you don't like what I say, I wasn't supposed to be here anyway. I'm filling in for another gentleman, but I hope you'll find my presentation intriguing nonetheless. Anyway, so good afternoon. I'm Zach Mottl, and I'm not an economist, but sometimes I find myself playing one on TV. And today I'm not even playing one on TV. I'm really representing myself as a small business owner and a manufacturer. And I'm proud to be the fourth generation of my family that owns and operates my business, Atlas Toolworks. My great-grandfather founded Atlas here in Chicago in 1918. And, the company, we've changed, we've evolved over the years. And today we're a precision component manufacturer. And our primary markets are aerospace and defense, medical, industrial equipment, and we've got a smattering of electronics, telecom, and we even make some consumer products thrown in just for good measure. But, we're very well diversified, and it wasn't always that way. For the first 80 years of our existence, we were heavily reliant on the telecom industry, and I think my company is a proxy for what happened in the telecom industry and throughout the world. That industry served us well until about 24 years ago when China was joined the WTO and was granted the most favored nation status. We saw a mass exodus of telecom manufacturing, not only from this country, but from North America and from Europe as well. And, it took a lot of work out of my shop. They were almost 80% of our business. And we watched all of our business really decline. From 99, we had our best year ever. And by 2001, our revenues were less than half, and we were bleeding pretty badly. And we needed to find new markets. But, my company wasn't unique in that we did a lot of telecom work. That was huge for manufacturers around this country. Nearly every one of my peers lost a significant chunk of their business when telecom left. But besides my roles in my family business and the reason that I'm here today, I serve as the chairman of the Technology and Manufacturing Association Government Relations Committee. TMA, we're a regional trade association, and Bill's been out there many times before. We certainly appreciate his insights always at TMA. But we have quite a depth and breadth of services. It really surpasses most national associations. We have 800 small manufacturing business members, most of them about the size of my company, and we represent 32,000 employees in the greater Chicagoland area. So most of them are in small to mid-sized manufacturing businesses. I also serve on the board of the Coalition of Prosperous America, and some of the more unique points that I will make today come from my work with them. CPA is a group of 4.1 million members consisting of manufacturers, farmers, ranchers, and labor. It's truly an unholy alliance. When do you ever see us all together singing from the same sheet of music? But we all tend to agree that, free trade really doesn't exist. It's a unicorn. There's no such thing. And the policies that have attempted to support free trade have been not necessarily so good for the USA, particularly for producers like us. And we also believe that persistent and excessive and ever-growing trade deficits are not good for the USA. And finally, we believe that the dollar is overvalued and is harming true wealth-generating industries, those that make things, grow things, and mine things here in the USA. And so, we think some of the policies that passed, they've really favored capital, and they've put labor at a disadvantage. And so we would like to see the pendulum swing the other way. So when I talk about this stuff, for some reason people listen. I guess in this room, I'm like the only real live manufacturer, right? So sometimes when I come and I talk about this stuff, people listen. A few months back, I testified before the House Ways and Means Committee twice in favor of the tax reform that became law. And, no offense to Chairman Brady and Speaker Ryan, but I think it was my testimony that put it over the top and put it on the president's desk. But seriously, though, the data in many of my slides that I want to show you came from TMA and CPA, and it might be different than what you're used to seeing. And just saying that I'm in favor of tariffs, right? I'm standing up before you today, probably the only person in this room that's in favor of the tariffs. That certainly puts me out of sync with many economists who forecasted dire results from the tariffs. But another joke, keep in mind, there's an old saying that economists don't make forecasts because they're good at it. They make forecasts because they get paid a lot of money to do it. I make parts and pieces, and I get paid to make perfect parts and pieces every time. And I believe that tariffs are doing just the opposite of what some people have feared. They're stimulating domestic demand. So what you've got here is a slide showing the Midwest manufacturers outlook. This is a monthly survey taken of those TMA members. We survey 325 of the 800 members in a regular and rather scientific manner. And you can see that most members are very positive for the past year about the U.S. economy. And you can see some timing issues here. When the tariffs were announced, there was a slight dip in some of the members' optimism about the U.S. economy. But since that time, you can see it's kind of bounced back up. Of course, those of you who know Illinois, you shouldn't be surprised about the trend in the Illinois economy. Many of our members are quite concerned, and me too. You know, we see ourselves as when they need money, they come to us to pay the taxes. So there's some concern there. But in general, members are very optimistic about the U.S. economy and quite optimistic about their own business. And, you know, since August of 2018, our data showed that 56% of the small to mid-sized manufacturers surveyed, they anticipated growth in sales over the next 12 months. That's the blue chart, blue bar rather. 41% anticipated increased capital spending in the next year. That's the red bar, and certainly supports some of what Bill was saying. And then 59% anticipate increased employment over the same period of time. So we really have some pretty positive trends here coming together for our local manufacturers. This slide shows the local manufacturers' pain points. And I know it's kind of hard to see maybe from where you're at. There's a lot of data on there. But what I'd like to point out in particular is that the primary pain point for manufacturers remains the lack of skilled workers. That's the one on the top, the 60%. All of them, I mean, nearly all 60% are reporting a difficult time finding skilled workers. And it's held a 2-to-1 lead over all the other pain points for all of 2018. And we did see in the data a slight increase of some concern about material costs as a pain point for manufacturers. It is believed that this increase may be the result of the tariff debate. But personally, I think it will go back down as we see some of the noise in the metals market go away. We've experienced some really unusual pricing things, some prices down, some up. I think it has more to do with what people have on hand, and if they perceive they can charge more for it, maybe they do. So hopefully that noise will sort out. And but it's clear that our member businesses, they're busy, they're hiring, and they seem to feel that there's a lot of demand for their products. Now, this next slide might be unexpected, but a slight majority of our TMA members do actually favor the tariffs. Most of the TMA companies, they're like mine, we're supply chain companies, and that means we make products for other, usually larger manufacturers as part of the global supply chain. Many of us don't export directly, but the products that we sell into get exported and sold around the world. So while TMA members might be frustrated by higher steel and aluminum costs, they often see it as short-term pain in the ones that I've talked to, and I share their view, because they are looking for the larger gain of reassuring entire supply chains. And, you know, the example of Boeing and the jet being made elsewhere, you know, I think that's a prime example of some of the pain we've seen in the past, right? There's no reason those parts couldn't be made here and installed in the jet and sold, other than perhaps it's more cost effective to make them in other countries for a variety of other reasons. So anyway, a lot of the optimism that I think TMA members have exhibited is really related to the improved demand picture. They're busy again, their order books are full, and profits are returning. They see tax cuts as good for their customers and good for making things in the U.S., and they see the Trump administration's moves as largely a good thing because they believe their customers will make more things here and need more of their services. Personally, myself, our order book is at its highest point in the history of the company. You know, we were a little bit slow the first 2 quarters, but the third and fourth quarter are really phenomenal, and my concern is how we're going to get it all out the door. So we have a very good problem on our hand right now. The next slide starts to talk about global imbalances. And, you know, why are we here having this discussion about tariffs? How did this pop up, right? For a lot of you, it sounds like this is like crazy talk. This totally this Trump came in and this tariff, so where did this come from? Well, you know, I believe the issue's been simmering beneath the surface for a long time. And despite the rosy picture a lot of economists have painted about the benefits of trade, I think the fact is it has not worked out for many. And, you know, no country in the history of the world went from poor poor to rich without a series of tariffs. And that includes the United States, right? And so, talk to Alexander Hamilton and those folks, they had that debate way back when. There were some free traders and they were primarily farmers. But in the end, these smart traders, the strategic traders won out that debate. And that's what really launched the United States in the growth of manufacturing and the industrialization of the U.S. through the 1800s. So, conversely, countries who run persistent trade deficits, I believe, will go from rich to poor. And we've seen in recent decades here in this country, wealth has become extremely concentrated at the top. And the pain everyday people like manufacturers, farmers, and ranchers, they're feeling this pain. This is what put the Trump administration here. And it's why he's taking these actions. So simply put, the pain is because we're eating the global oversupply among industrial nations. And you can see these surplus countries here, Germany, China, Japan, Korea, they're overproducing and underconsuming, and they're relying on us of becoming the consumer for last resort. And this really has a negative effect on our wages and job growth for the average American. And look at deficit countries, US, UK, Spain, Portugal, and Greece. I mean, low growth, stagnation, underutilized plant, and we just see our demand leaking overseas as these imports come in. So I believe that US trade action will and should continue until we figure out how to quit the job of being consumer of last resort. And we see some of these surplus countries consume their surpluses, and we see some of these deficit countries deal with their deficits. So the next slide shows the top 10 trade deficit countries with the United States. Clearly, China is at the top of the pile here and really driving some of the imbalances, the bilateral imbalances with the United States. And, it hasn't happened by accident, right? If you listen to Dr. Navarro, I know some of you may not be a fan of his. I am, know him personally and appreciate what he says. He gave a presentation at the Peterson Institute, and he gave us 54 plus ways from Sunday that the Chinese have captured market share. And what they're trying to do is build up their global champions. They protect them domestically. They have very high tariffs right now and very high non-tariff barriers. They subsidize their industry, and then they turn them loose on the world. I've said this to my friends at Boeing. How are you going to compete in 10 years? They're flying their first single-aisle jet right now, and price and profit doesn't matter to them. They will undercut you until you're out of business. We've seen that happen in the telecom industry. Lucent's gone, Nortel's gone, Tellab's gone, Nokia's on the ropes. We watch Huawei rise out of nothing. We watch ZTE rise. So, I really have some concerns about that. But again, in terms of manufacturing, China really is a manufacturing powerhouse. And global surplus countries are an issue, like I showed on the last slide, but China took it to a whole new level. And the issue of supply chains leaving the U.S., say the supply chains companies like mine sell into, when China joined the WTO, we saw on some of the other slides, we saw a sudden drop. TMA, we saw an 800-member drop in our membership. Over half of our members went out of business in a 10-year period after China joined the WTO. That was not by accident. And here you go. It's no wonder why. TMA members struggled as their customers moved work overseas. High-tech sectors like telecom, where we were the leader, they were the first to go. Pricing power and profitability was depressed among the small manufacturers and supply chain companies for 2 decades. And I'm not talking about the big global manufacturers. I'm talking about those of us who feed in the supply chain. The big global companies were happy to bring in low-price parts here, put it together, and sell it to this rich and robust marketplace and export it around the world using low-cost inputs and really inflating their margins. So, now as demand is returning here to the small manufacturers, as we saw in the first slides, there's the new pain point, the lack of skilled workers. But it's not surprising to me because during those years, who was going to train? Who was going to go into an apprenticeship? So we've got a little bit of lag here as we start to build that workforce back up. But I think we will, and I think some of the other data that was presented earlier is absolutely correct. We are still the most competitive place to make things once you equate for some of the other factors. So, economists told us not to worry while all of that was happening. Those jobs would be replaced with better jobs. We would be retrained and move up to the next rung of the ladder. But look at the data. These are not better jobs. These jobs that have been created, the food service, drinking place jobs, they're going to surpass manufacturing. And I was frustrated to see some information put out by the St. Louis Fed recently kind of championing this. And I just imagine, would you ever see the Central Bank of China or Germany championing the loss of manufacturing jobs and the rise of these low-wage service sector jobs? I mean, that was a little frustrating to me. But at any rate, you can see that these are not better jobs here. And most workers have actually taken a significant pay cut. They're working 2 jobs to get to 40 hours. They're not full-time. They don't have the same benefits as the good jobs in manufacturing. But I think we need a better way to measure that. So my friends at CPA we've been talking a lot about this, and we're coming up with the Job Quality Index in partnership with Cornell University. We've already patented this, and you'll probably see it in the news pretty soon. But so that's why, we've got a better way. It's called the Job Quality Index. And in a nutshell, it takes non-supervisory payroll data, and it measures how far above or below it is from the national average. There are some other factors as well as hours worked and things worked into that equation. But you can see that since the early 90s, we've not really been moving folks up the ladder, despite what we have heard. Kind of peaked here, as you can see, in 1993, and the index was at a low point in 2012. So, I hope you'll watch the news and you'll see more about this. But when we overlay on this next slide the trade deficit and the job quality index, somebody almost said this slide earlier today, but this is it. So I believe that this is why the trade deficit is such a problem. It's sucking wealth out of the middle class of our country, and we see the social ills that come with it. We've got deaths of despair. We've got, opioid crisis in the rural America, where manufacturing used to be. We have people on opioids. We have farmers killing themselves because they are the most efficient farmers in the world. They can put out more grain than anybody else, but they can't make a profit. They can't make a profit, and there's something wrong with that. There's absolutely something wrong. So anyway, and deficit countries, like the US, the UK, they got Brexit and we got Donald Trump. We see relative political harmony in those surplus countries. So I think there's something to be said there about that. But a lot of folks, thank goodness, are seeing the light here. Today is a new world. They're starting to recognize that free trade, at least the kind they built their models around, which, by the way, I have access, you all know about the REMI models through CPA. We have the REMI models. I found it interesting. We did some modeling, and every time we increased GDP, the trade deficit went up. Wait a second. It's built right in the model. There's some bad assumptions built right in the model. But anyway, we'll get onto that more. So, like I said, I think free trade doesn't exist, and we need smart trade, not free trade. But even some economists are coming around too. You've got some notable folks, probably some names that that have admitted they were absolutely wrong on this. So what can we do about that? I guess that's really the question, if you're following me and kind of agree with some of what I'm saying. I think it starts with currency, as I asked in some of the other discussion. While tariffs, they can stimulate domestic demand, tariffs, trade agreements, they only affect composition of trade, what we trade with who. And so the thing about the soybeans, right? If the Chinese are tariffing their soybeans, our soybeans will be bought by somebody else. We might not trade soybeans with the Chinese, but we will trade them with someone else, because we still have our soybeans. They're going to go somewhere, and there's demand in the marketplace. If the Chinese got their soy from Brazil, now the Europeans need to buy their soy from America. They used to buy from Brazil. So I really think that tariffs and trade agreements are about composition, and balance of trade is driven by currency, and it drives persistent global imbalances. So here you go. Somebody else mentioned this slide as well. The dollar's value and the current account deficit, completely linked. Look at this. And you shouldn't be surprised, but what should be surprising is, why doesn't this correct itself? It's broken. You can see, normally in the world, we would expect that the value of the dollar would start to go down and this would start to correct itself, but it's not. It's lost that linkage because we are the reserve currency of the world. We have these uncontrolled capital imbalances that come in. So some more smart short-term solutions for trade and economic growth. I think the Trump administration is really taking care of number one, eliminating trade cheating. They're kind of going after that pretty hard. And trade cheating goes on in a lot of ways. My question about the non-tariff barriers, you can argue that's cheating or not. We don't have a VAT tax. We don't have a GST tax. We're one of the few countries in the world. That's perhaps foolish. I argued that during the House Ways and Means hearing. They didn't pick that one up. But, there are a lot of ways that people cheat on trade, and the Chinese have certainly led the fight there. Another solution that I'm going to tell you about in the next slide, and I'm a big fan of this, is the market access charge. It's developed by fellow board member John Hanson at CPA. He was at the World Bank for many, many years, and this is his clever way to help slowly bring the dollar back to a trade equilibrium balancing value. Then industrial policy. I don't know why that's a four-letter word in a lot of discussions. You talk about industrial policy and people think, we're going to pick winners and losers and stuff. To me, it's about setting the table that's appealing for manufacturers and for things to be made here again. And we really haven't had an industrial policy in this country since Alexander Hamilton was around, and I think we need to get back to it, because every single one of our trading partners, the UK, Germany, the Asian countries, they all have industrial policies. And then wage conversions. I also have some friends, the head of the Teamsters Union, he's actually in the NAFTA negotiations right now. Mike Dolan serves on the CPA board with me as well, and they're pushing for this wage convergence. We've heard it in the NAFTA talks. This is what they're talking about. You know, we'd like to see the Mexicans be able to buy some of the cars that they're making and sending over here and buy some of the food products, but when they devalued their currency so aggressively after NAFTA, it certainly didn't help them become consumers of any of the products that we're making. So we think these four things would be good short-term solutions. But let's talk about the MAC a little bit more here, the market access charge. We believe it's the Fed's missing tool. The Fed does a great job with its mandate and it manages money supply within the country, but it does not have a way to control excessive and uncontrolled capital inflows coming from outside the country, right? So the MAC would give the Fed that tool, and it's like a peak load charge on electricity, right? When on hot days in the summer, when all the air conditioners are running, they don't shut off the power. They just charge you more for it to help mitigate demand. And so, you know, when demand would be high, the MAC would kick in, and this is a very small percentage on dollar-denominated transactions. It's not even a penny, very small, but it would slowly help bring, and it goes up when the dollar keeps getting higher, back to a competitive and correct value. And right now there is a bill in Congress, and it's gaining traction. It's called the Competitive Dollar for Jobs and Prosperity Act. So we're going to keep pushing for that, and maybe perhaps you'll hear more about that in the future. But we really believe it would be a smart solution, and it's neutral. It's not a political solution. It would be administered by the Fed, who does a wonderful job with monetary policy already. So why not give them one more tool to control the piece that they don't have control of? So long-term, trade surpluses deliver growth. I mean, look at this chart here. So the GDP growth that we were talking about, Bill, going into 2020, 1%. I mean, to me, compared to some of our friends on this chart, it's pretty anemic. It's pretty poor. I would love to see us up in the 3 to 4% range, like most of our surplus countries. I mean, Malaysia, Taiwan, even Germany. So those of us who say that tariffs are so bad, why is it working so well for these countries? These are some of the most protectionist countries in the world, and it has helped them go from poor to rich in a very short amount of time, So anyway, like I said, not an economist, but I hope that I've given you some thought-provoking things here today. I thank you for the time and giving me the honor and the opportunity to be here. Thank you.
Thanks, Zach. So we have time, and I think we can still a little bit of extra time, right? So questions? Catherine.
So a specific question that I have actually to Bill is a lot of people have talked about relaxation of regulation. Actually, Zach, you can perhaps answer. Is there a metric that we would look at to evaluate whether or not, they're actually, whether the regulations that have been relaxed, and that's kind of very narrow. I am going to take a stab at some of the things that Zach used to say.
Do we want to answer that first point? Okay. So I would just say, I don't know of any metrics that exist outside of, most of our roundtables that we hold and our contacts in the business community. There has definitely been a sea change in terms of their view about, the competitiveness of doing business, that view, and there is definitely a sense that regulations are not going to continue to get more stringent, and if anything, they're moving in the opposite direction, and they have taken that as a positive. And I think that's when you look at the business confidence surveys.
Is it sentiment, or is it actually like, the number of pages of regulation? For example, for a lot of trade regulation, we've done.
Right.
Look at the number of pages.
I'm just going with the sentiment.
The sentiment is different,
right,
from reality, and
possibly, yeah.
And I'm trying to get at whether it's sentiment, of which there are many reasons why people feel better or worse.
So, do you know of anything on the regulation side?
So I would,
other than coal and
I would echo that about perception and reality, right? And sometimes perception does drive reality, and I think it is more sentiment leading this. In fact, we've seen an increase in regulation with cybersecurity, but that's just related to our industry. So I think it's a very positive perception. We will see if reality follows. How to measure it, I don't know.
All right, now go for your...
there's a whole range of things, and I'm not going to disagree with a lot, actually. So a couple of things. Starting with the last chart, I think it is valuable to make a distinction between trade surpluses delivering growth. Trade surplus delivers growth as measured by GDP. Domestic people do not eat. Investment. Ultimately the piece. When you're running a trade surplus, you are actually doing harm to yourself. Because you're taking away a chunk of your production and giving it to somebody else.
So I would agree with that, because those countries are not consuming their surpluses, right?
And that's not good for those countries' citizens.
It's not good, but I think the point is that it's so far out of balance. I'm not necessarily arguing that we go so far the other way, but that we get a little more balance and we find ways for those countries to take more of their surpluses and consume them.
It's something that we actually argue a lot for those countries.
And we don't have a lot of control over other countries, right? We can only control ourselves oftentimes, so which is where I get to with the dollar.
Yeah. Well, so, yeah, the dollar. I did write a book.
I didn't.
Work on this topic. But going backwards on industrial policy, if you look at the last, a lot of work that's been done now, as I left the OECD and moved on to my new job, we focused a lot on policies of focusing on regions. Because the major loss in terms of employment and productivity, and some of the issues that you speak to directly, but this is true more broadly, is that regions that have concentrated manufacturing tend to do extremely well when the core does well, and falls further when the core is stripped out. Think of it as Michael Porter's clusters, which everybody thinks is a great idea. If you have manufacturing, you've got a cluster, it does extremely well, and it does so well that all the services in the regions are priced out of the business. Then, when the core gets lost, the entire thing crumbles, and there's nothing left because there are no services there anymore. Pick up the job. So there's really an essential issue about clusters and regions that create an opportunity to think about place-based policies that are different from national policies. And so it's in essence saying we can even find early warning indicators for which regions of a country are more likely to be exposed to shocks, whether it be technology, like roboticization, and issues with regard to either shocks from trade or technology. So I'm suggesting that the lens that you should be thinking about with regard to policy has a more narrow focus than the national lens in order to actually get at what is the particular issue that comes with. Now, I'm fixing the dollar, right?
May I respond to that?
And then you can take me off.
Okay. I'm more looking to agree, actually. But.
On the dollar, the challenge there, of course, and it is absolutely, the dollar is not particularly related to the trade balance and hasn't been basically since the origin of the floating rate period. Financial flows dominate the dollar. Financial flows drive trade. So your MAC index is kind of like a transactions tax, except for particularly the way, at least I think I understood it, is the tax increases as the dollar appreciates.
Correct.
So that it's not just a flat tax, some per flow, but it actually is as you said, a peak load pricing.
Correct.
Tax. So you would actually find a lot of support for a transactions tax. You would find a lot of support for a transactions tax even in the financial community, because of the belief that algorithmic trading and like nanosecond by nanosecond trading is damaging to financial markets. We can find, and with a lot of developing countries or emerging markets, with you 100% for transactions tax. Having that transactions tax be modulated by the movement in the exchange value of the dollar gets a little bit dicier, because against which currency? We have a different transactions tax for each bilateral currency as it appreciates vis-a-vis the dollar.
My understanding it's against a basket.
If you do that, just think about the arbitrage opportunities that you have opened up for people that work with me. And I bet you wouldn't like the outcome of that. So, interesting potential idea, a lot of support in a lot of ways for flat transactions tax, but this modulated one, I don't think it's operational.
Interesting, and I will take that back to the real economists who've helped me, with my data here, and I would welcome if any of you would like to hear more. I'm sure GIC can get put in touch with some of the people that helped me here, but my understanding is that it works against a basket of currencies. It would be set against a basket, so it wouldn't be against, individual currencies, but I don't understand all of the mechanism of it, so we'd have to think a little bit more about it. I will also take the feedback that it was interesting that you think there would be support for that because we thought that would be exactly the opposite we would find. But anyway, back to the clusters point you made, I certainly agree with that. In fact, that's why my company remains in Chicago and Cook County, despite the ridiculously high taxes here. We're in a cluster that helps make us so successful. Our platers are nearby, our painters are nearby, and back to my telecom industry roots, our big customer used to be nearby. Western Electric was right up the road when, it was the early, 1900s. So I totally believe that. And my pain point in 2000 was when the telecom cluster, so to speak, left this whole country. But what I failed to understand or appreciate, or maybe you can answer, like with Foxconn, right, these states, it sounds like what you would be arguing is that, for more micro incentives and more micro policy, and then we get these where one state's competing against the other, one city's competing against the other, and we've got, I certainly agree with that, and I'm down in Springfield advocating the same thing, and in Cook County as well advocating the same thing, but I'm not necessarily sure it's right, but I appreciate the point and don't really disagree either. I just don't know what is right or what right answer. I think it's a little both, really.
So I think we have Kevin had a couple comments on this topic too.
Yeah, so I just feel like I need to defend the honor of economists.
It was meant to be a friendly joke. I apologize.
By the way, I just want to thank Zach for coming into the Lions Den, the Chicago Fed, home of economists, and so thank you. Thank you. All right, no,
just because economists, by and large, are free traders, and I agree there's no such thing as free trade, but there still are some things called comparative advantage that still matter. Just a couple comments. To me, as an economist, it's puzzling why steel users would favor policies that raise their input costs. That's puzzling to me.
Let me just offer one reason for that. Also coming off of a lot of our roundtables is when the economy is as hot as it is in one of the strongest economies, they're finding the ability of passing along those costs to the customers. I think we would find a very different attitude, Zach, if the economy was not growing at 3%, but growing much slower, where they were to be struggling trying to pass those along.
Pricing power is back, and that's a wonderful thing after 20 years.
The other, just a couple other comments. You say your order book is full, yet the dollar is overvalued, so that seems like an inconsistency to me. I think you're right that globalization has had an effect on reducing manufacturing employment. But certainly, automation has also had an effect on reducing employment, substitution of capital for labor. And that's been going on for decades. I used to be a farmer in eastern Colorado, and the average size of the farm in Colorado now is several thousand acres, and 100 years ago it was 40 or 50. So that is a factor that you can't ignore. We've heard the same arguments with China today that we heard with Japan in the 1980s, that Japan was going to take over the world, and clearly they didn't. And my last comment, well, next to last comment, is that as a Hamilton-phile, Alexander Hamilton favored tariffs because that was the primary way that the government raised revenue.
Absolutely.
And his primary concern at that time was to pay off the debt incurred during the Revolutionary War and establish a good credit rating for the U.S. So I want to make that point. And then finally, I think as my results showed and other results have showed, domestic factors dominate. The gains from trade certainly are positive. Economists estimate anywhere from 2 to 8% of GDP. They're not huge, but they're not small either. So I think when you get the domestic economy right, that benefits you at the end of the day.
Any other questions from?
One to the right, Steve.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes, I'm Syracuse Hale from EconView. My question is for Zach very specifically. Loved your presentation. It's good to hear firing line. But if the point of change for most people are finding good workers, why aren't you raising wages?
I am.
Why aren't you investing in more automation to offset what Bill was talking about? What are most people doing? Why don't they react?
I think we are doing all of that. So I can tell you anecdotally, I've been giving raises all summer. The average raise has been 4 to 5%. So it jives with exactly the data you're saying. I'm very concerned about maintaining and keeping my top workforce. I'm very lucky to have such much talent at our place. So want to keep those people and then attracting other ones. Yes. I mean, you can't offer the outside more than you're paying your guy right now doing it or gal. So you have to raise their wages first, and then you can start raising the wages that you're offering on the outside to attract more people in. As far as automation, we are working on that. Some is easier said than done. Our business in particular is a high mix, low volume, high complexity business, and it's not always well suited to automation for all of its processes. But we've invested in technology like these massive multi-axis machines that used to do, you move it from one machine to the next for the different operations. Now one machine does it all at once, even though it's relatively low volume. So we've seen some improvements there. I think in general, the automation will help my labor problem more in the service industry, especially the low rung, where you're going to be ordering your food at McDonald's on the screen, and now I can hire the manager of McDonald's who's got some brains in her head and move her up into a manufacturing job. So that's where I see automation really helping manufacturing. Did I miss a piece of your question? Thank you.
Done.
Is there a preferred explanation that the panel has for the decline in capacity utilization peaks? We keep peaking at lower and lower numbers. Is that obsolescence? Is that something else?
That's a great question, and one that I have struggled to come up with an answer myself. And one begins to wonder how much of some of the capacity that's out there is maybe antiquated and is not being reflective of the more high-tech technology that's out there. So you might have a lot of machinery still sitting out there, but maybe isn't the most optimum.
And then 78 could be the old 80, if that's the case. Peak at a lower number, you have to have some sort of trend.
It's been getting older since, that's the version, that's another way of talking about that age profile for not just the U.S. economy, but for all advanced economies, that capital is really old.
Right. So it used to be that, I'll tell a quick story. When I was growing up, my father ran a machine shop building comforter and quilting machines in New York, and I got hired for the summer, which was one of the best jobs I ever had. Convinced me to go get a really good education because I didn't want to do this for the rest of my life. But I was running a Bridgeport milling machine, and it was, turning dials and having that cutting tool come in, and I would come in too fast and break the tool. But it that machine was probably older, probably twice as old as I was, but still worked. That is not how manufacturers today think about their machines. And that's why the timing of when you buy these high-tech machines, which go down in value because of it being computer-related, becomes critical. And the payback, well, I'll ask Zach, what do you think your typical member, what they want to get paid back on their machine is in today's environment?
Well, I'm sure they'd like to get paid back in 2 to 3 3 years, but that's not the case.
Right.
It's typically a 5, 10, or longer year payback period, and those machines last 20 years typically, you expect.
Right, 5 to 7 years is what I've often heard for the payback, and that has been cut down substantially from, typically a 20 to 30-year life cycle, because they understand they either have to rebuild the brains of the machine as technology improves, or just have to replace it altogether.
Yeah, I echo everything that you just said there.
Is there a question on the upper?
Well, I think it's been addressed, but I've been watching the productivity drop discussion for the last year or two, and I can understand why manufacturers themselves are a little cautious. What lessons have we learned in the past? Invest, how long's the market? Is there going to be a bust? So what do I do then with those capital investments? But are there other ways? Is it just capital investment in equipment to do productivity? Or is it, what have we learned in the past, I guess?
Well, productivity comes about from a host, and that's why it's very difficult to really put your thumb on the pulse of what's driving it. Productivity comes about by adding machinery to the equation, comes about by adding better machinery to the equation. It comes about by educating your workforce, as Zach was talking about, to make sure that they're capable of running the equipment and knowing how to. I mean, we've actually heard from a manufacturer early this year that sent a piece of equipment back because the piece of equipment was too sophisticated for their available workforce, and they kept smashing the machine. It was a $25,000 cost every time they did it. They did it 3 times, and they went back to the manufacturer and said, give us one of your lower skilled level machines, because we just can't run this one. So it is a matter of making sure that your workforce, and not just in manufacturing, but that's kind of my top concern for the U.S. economy as a whole. As you think about some of the technologies coming down the path, whether it's AI, autonomous, can be very, very devastating to the number of jobs that are out there, making sure you have your workforce prepared to move into other areas that have some value.
I would just add that, going back to Joseph Schumpeter, economists have long known that innovation and the development of new ideas is crucial to developing and growing an economy. So, we aren't a monopoly producer on new ideas. New ideas are generated across the world. So if you wall yourself off from the rest of the world, you potentially remove a key source of growth and development for your economy. Not only in terms of that, but also the importing of individuals who may be very smart, who want to get an education here.
So,
As a follow-up?
So I agree with what Kevin just said about the innovation, and that's really the game changer. But I would just add that innovation doesn't just hover above the Great Plains, you're right? It typically is tied with where you make the product, especially in manufacturing, at least the type of innovation. I mean, talk about chip innovation and these things. When you stop making the things here, you lose those incremental gains in innovation. And I would also echo what Bill said about these super complex machines. I spent several $1 million on new equipment in 2015, and we still haven't quite figured out exactly how to make it do all the amazing things that it's supposed to do. So I share that sentiment. There's a lot of gains to be made as we continue to train and learn about our workforce, and our equipment.
Summarizing what I heard is, one, to increase our productivity, we need to train our labor force more, and 2, maybe we need to find more ways to innovate in the incubators, the M-hubs, the other places to create that. Is that a correct interpretation, or?
Yeah, but I still, my main point was that we are in the process of seeing an investment cycle which had been lacking for the first, let's call it 7 years of the expansion, that is now coming back and making up for some lost time. And I think just having that capital deepening, as we refer to it in economics, is going to allow productivity to do better, to give the means of making each and every worker who uses those technologies and the machinery more productive.
And even Zach said that, manufacturers and non-manufacturers as well bemoan the lack of qualified workers.
Absolutely.
And again, those are a function of domestic factors, not international factors.
So I feel the large and looming hook to my left. But can we just thank the panel?